Hi everyone. Thank you for joining us today for the CWS Wildlife Chronicles webinar. We are delighted to have you with us on Earth Day. My name is Simran Prasad, and I'm a doctoral fellow at the Center for Wildlife Studies. Center for Wildlife Studies is a 37-year-old non-profit organization with a focus in conservation science, education, and policy. We used to invite speakers to our office to talk about the latest topics in conservation, education, and policy, but because of the COVID situation, we launched CWS Wildlife Chronicles. I'm fascinated by the role of economics in conserving nature, and I'm excited to moderate what I'm sure will be an insightful discussion today. If you enjoy our webinars and you're interested in what we do, you can write to us at outreach@cwsindia.org. It gives me great pleasure to introduce our distinguished panelists. Professor Andrew Balmford is a professor of conservation science at the University of Cambridge, United Kingdom. Professor Balmford's research primarily focuses on the costs and benefits of conservation and identifying solutions by evaluating the effectiveness of conservation efforts. His research predominantly focuses on the reason why natural spaces are being lost. Welcome, Professor Balmford.
Thank you.
I'd like to introduce you all to Dr. Naidoo, who is a senior conservation scientist and lead wildlife scientist at the World Wildlife Fund, USA. Dr. Naidoo's work is centered around the ecological and economic issues that affect wildlife conservation. His work also involved mapping ecosystem services to track animal migrations, and he hopes to use his work to support a future where species and people can coexist. Welcome, Dr. Naidoo.
Thanks, very pleased to be here.
To complete our distinguished panel, we are delighted to have a professor in environmental and resource economics with us today. Professor Sumeet Gulati is based at the University of British Columbia, Canada. Professor Gulati's research focuses on the economics of wildlife conservation and the economics of urban transportation. His research estimates the cost of conflict with wildlife to farmers living close to wildlife reserves in India, with a particular interest in valuing the human casualties resulting from this conflict. A very warm welcome, Professor Gulati.
Thank you, Simran. Thank you for having me.
So CWS welcomes all our esteemed panelists. And the first question, which springs up in everybody's mind, is what role do economics play in wildlife conservation? I'd like to open this question up to all of our panelists. Professor Gulati, what are your thoughts on this?
Thanks, Simran. Okay, so what role does economics play? You know, the thing is, I'm trained as an economist, right? So, and I think maybe this is instinctive and maybe that's why I chose economics, but I've seen economics, I mean, to me, economics plays an important influence in almost every decision we make. And so, but it's also sort of, I've learned as I've sort of worked through my training and I've worked through being an economist, it's important to recognize that economics is not the entire story as well. So I'm not going to say it is, but there was no singular experience. It's sort of just, I think, an instinctive importance of incentives in human choices. And I chose, I think, a training that helped me reinforce it. I think in conservation, economics is very important in sort of determining the landscapes we conserve, the species we choose to protect, and whether we poach, trade endangered species. I think it plays a role in lots of important ways.
Thank you, Professor Gulati. Dr. Naidoo, would you like to share your thoughts with us?
Yeah, sure, for sure. And I agree with Sumeet that it's, you know, it's difficult to think of issues in conservation where a discipline like economics, you know, doesn't have a role to play, just because, you know, the problems that we're dealing with and the potential solutions are really, you know, related to the decisions that we make as people. And that's, you know, what economics can help us better understand. You know, for me, I came to economics a bit later in my graduate student career. So I was on a track where I was going to pursue, you know, a very sort of ecological or natural sciences career, studying ecology and forest ecology in particular. But when I was doing my master's, there was two really formative pieces of work that I read that really first alerted me and I think many other people who were interested in biodiversity in the natural world, you know, to their economic value. And those were sort of really fundamental pieces by Bob Costanza in Nature. There was an accompanying piece to that paper called The Value of Everything, which really struck me, and also a book edited by Gretchen Daly called Nature's Services. So this was quite a while ago now, back in 1997, so 25 years ago. And since then, our understanding, I think, of the science behind the type of valuations that those papers noted has advanced. But those early pieces to me really hit home in that, it made me think that nature and biodiversity aren't just luxuries that only some people can afford to care about, but they're really fundamental to everything we do as people, and that there are techniques and methods from economics that can give us a sense of how substantial the trade-offs are when we're thinking about different types of land and resource use and different development trajectories. So they're really fundamental to conservation, but also really fundamental to my own experience and development as a conservation professional.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Naidoo. Professor Balmford, what are your views on this?
Thanks, Imran. So, I mean, I'd obviously echo what Sumeet and Robin have said. I'm an ecologist who tries to hard to work with people like economists because I've got a lot to learn. And I think my motivation for being a conservationist is undoubtedly a moral one. I think conservation. I think we should leave the world in no worse a place than we find it, and that it's immoral to be responsible for wiping species off the face of the earth, etc. So that's my personal motivation. But I also realise that that's not everyone's motivation, and that other motivations are equally valid and very important. And economics, in that sense, can help us speak to other people. I've long been struck as a biologist who comes at problems with biological ideas about what's going on, that they're all very well, but ultimately conservation problems are all about humans. They're all about human behavior. And as conservationists, what we're trying to do is alter unsustainable behavior and encourage sustainable behavior. And economics has always been explained to me as the study of human behavior. And so in that sense, I think there's just an awful lot to understand from economics and from other fields about what motivates people and how to alter those motivations, perhaps, so that we get more sustainable outcomes. So that's my reason for thinking it's so important. Just one example: a few years ago, I was involved in I was writing a book about success stories in conservation, and in the course of that, went to visit a community in southwest Ecuador, which happens to be more or less coincident with close to the last remaining blocks of a particular type of forest. This is west of the Andes, exceptionally biodiverse, 95% or something like that gone in the last, since the Second World War. So an extraordinarily important place for conservation. And for the last 20 or 30 years, that community had been subject to all the conventional conservation arguments from the outside world as to why they should conserve this forest. It was the last home of all these species, that they had a global responsibility, and these things were extraordinary, all the usual arguments. And it wasn't changing things. Then an ecologist who was working there at the time, who was catching birds, was doing so in mist nets set in the forest. When they caught birds, they were taking them out into the forest, into clearings to process them. And in the course of doing that, of course, being a biologist, they thought, well, why am I doing this? I'm doing it because it's not raining out there, so the birds are less likely to get cold while I'm handling them. It's not raining, but it's not the rainy season, it's the dry season. And during the dry season, it was still dripping inside the forest because it was a fog forest that was intercepting fog during the dry season. And so then she thought, well, hang on a minute, that's what these people get from this forest. It's not the sense that there's a hummingbird here found nowhere else on Earth. It's the fact that it provides the water that they depend on to keep their fields going during the dry season. Long story short, economic analysis done with the local community of what the value of those forests were. And within 3 months, their fate was turned around. And the whole of the remaining forest was conserved because the local community decided it was in their interest to do so. That was putting an economic valuation on something where all those moral arguments had previously failed. And that's really what I found that an inspirational story as to why economics is so important.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Balmford. And thank you all for that as well. Staying with you, Professor Balmford, what conservation goals do you think are achievable by incorporating economic approaches such as costs and benefits of conservation decisions into the field?
That's a very good question, Simran. I think a lot of different parts of the piece. So I think one of them is getting people's attention, actually, or putting things in a way which resonates with people, and that can be people at all sorts of different levels. It might be the villagers in that community who, when the value of the water was, when they calculated the value of the water they were losing through allowing outsiders to clear their forest, that got their attention. They realised that was an issue, a problem, and a real problem for their well-being. It might be the attention of world leaders or anyone in between. So getting the attention of people, I think that's, or of different and very important communities of people, I think it can then motivate and help design projects, interventions, whether that's large-scale policy interventions, whether it's protected areas, payment for ecosystem service schemes, all sorts of things to try and change current actions. And then I think last, it can help obviously understand, help us understand what the problems which any of those interventions might face, what unintended consequences they might create, what tensions, what inequities they might impose on people. And those are going to be key to better designing any changes, any interventions, so that they might have a chance of enduring.
Great, thank you, Professor Balmford. Professor Gulati, how does quantifying the costs of conservation and the understanding of causation aid us in applying effective conservation management techniques?
Here. Yeah, okay. So quantifying the costs of conservation. I mean, I think one of the reasons, so yeah, thanks for this question. And one of the reasons I started collaborating with CWS and Kriti is partly because I was very interested in quantifying the costs of human-wildlife conflict. And I think you can sort of move from that on to quantifying the costs of conservation. And when I sort of think about conservation as a whole, I have this sort of harkening back to what Andrew was just saying. I have this simpler sort of morality, which has been trained by economics, and I'll get into that a little bit more later, but where I think costs and benefits are, as long as you measure these costs holistically, not just what the market measures. So I don't want to say costs should be only measured by the market. But once you incorporate all the true costs and benefits of most of our actions, including conservation, we can make better informed decisions around how we should be, what sort of policies we should be implementing. And so sort of that's where I look at costs and benefits. It's a sort of a bigger view than just more narrow market costs and benefits. When it comes to causation, I feel like it's one of the things economists have focused on, but it's not only economists have focused on this, actually. I think we've learned all of this from people who were studying medical interventions. And the whole idea of looking at counterfactual thinking, which is, because often, I remember Robin was giving a talk at UBC where he pointed out the fundamental problem being that you cannot see both outcomes for a single individual. So we have to sort of come up with what is our control group, what is our counterfactual, and just being able to think counterfactually helps us sort of recognize which policies work and which ones don't. So I think in a combination, you put together these costs and benefits, and you put together this idea of counterfactual thinking, and you can make, I think, more accurate predictions on what will work and what may not.
Right. Yes. Okay, great. Thank you, Professor Gulati. Dr. Naidoo, as you know, we face imminent threats to biodiversity and natural spaces worldwide. What concepts and disciplines do you think we should engage with to improve our efforts in conservation management and policy?
Yeah, thanks. That's a great question. You know, I think there's a whole variety of different disciplines that we need to be engaging with. So I think, you know, economics is one of them, but there are many others, and that's because, you know, conservation is just you know, an inherently interdisciplinary problem. So we need to, you know, be collaborating with people, you know, economists, yes, other types of social scientists as well. So, you know, thinking about anthropologists, sociologists, you know, folks who can really help us understand, you know, people better. So economics gives us one way of thinking about how people make decisions, and Sumeet just mentioned that really nicely. It's when the the benefits of the benefits writ large exceed the costs. That's when people are most likely to to make decisions. And so by better understanding those costs and benefits, it's important to be able to understand those, so that we can we can better understand the motivations of people when they make decisions that are either pro-conservation or anti-conservation. There's other disciplines as well in the natural sciences, so remote sensing, earth systems, agricultural science, and probably many others that I'm forgetting about. But I think it's fundamental to think about how all of these can contribute to solving biodiversity problems, because again, they're so inherently multidisciplinary and cross-cutting. And I think in some ways natural scientists and economists make easier partners than some of the other social sciences, given that even though there can be language or sort of technical mathematical barriers to that communication, there's nevertheless a focus on quantitative analyses in both economics and ecology. And so there's that common ground that I think you can relate to once you break down some of the jargon that tends to isolate disciplines, especially these days. I think it's a little bit harder to to potentially find common ground with disciplines that are just very different in their approach, that rely on qualitative methods and so forth. But I think it's really fundamental, in addition to the increasing collaboration that I do think we see between ecologists and economists, to bring on board some of these other social scientists, because ultimately, even though biodiversity conservation is a global problem, if we're not able to effectively work with the local people, whose decisions are the ones that make or break whether conservation is going to be successful, we'll fail, in this global goal. And so I think it's really important to harness that kind of expertise, where we can to allow us to do better conservation.
Great, thank you, Dr. Naidoo. And now I'd like to address a question to all of our panelists. Drawing on your research and experience, what are the primary threats to biodiversity that could be better understood by using economic approaches? Professor Balmford, would you like to go first?
Only by giving a bad answer, which is I think all of them, actually. I mean, pretty much all the threats to biodiversity that I know of are as a result of our behaviour, and economics is about changing, well, no, it's about understanding our behaviour, and if we want to change our behaviour, we need economic insights as well as others, as Robin was just saying, to do so. So for me, I suspect all threats are going to, addressing any threat is probably going to be more powerful if in most cases, I guess. I suppose it may depend, rather than the threat type, the level at which you're thinking of intervening. So if you're after if it's an extremely urgent situation, as a conservationist, your action might literally be, get these creatures out of harm's way. Put them into a captive breeding facility, or bring them together when they're scattered across a landscape, or identify the cause, find this disease and work on a solution. So it might be at that level an inherently biological problem. And so I suppose it's more to do with the level at which, but we are going to be, I think we're going to be doing anything other than treating symptoms. We need to be digging back to what's causing the issue, and that will, in almost all cases, be something we're doing. And that's when we need to think about, if we're going to be addressing any of those drivers, we certainly need to be bringing economics in as a key part of the toolbox, I think.
Great, thank you, Professor Balmford. Professor Gulati, can you share your experience with us?
Yeah, so, Andrew said something right when he started about economics, about how he thought of it as something that explains human behavior. And And that's how I've always sort of thought of economics, as being a primary, not primary necessarily, but certainly an important influencer in human behavior. And understanding that is super important. So sort of like what he said, I think economics is, there's several issues in biodiversity conservation that are better understood if you bring the lens of economic incentives to their analysis. If I had to choose one, I'd say perhaps the most important one is thinking about the ingress of human activity into animal habitat. I think that's probably the primary one that I think a lot about today, and how we as a society have chosen to develop and the incentives we create to exploit sometimes the last remaining wild locations of the world are critical. An understanding of that is critical in their preservation. So I think if we want to change that trend, perhaps understanding the economic and political drivers, which are sometimes often economic too, is extremely important.
Thank you, Professor Gulati. Dr. Naidoo, what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think Andrew and Sumeet have covered this, very well. They've made really the 2 points that I wanted to make, and I guess the first is that if in my experience, if we're thinking about primary threats to biodiversity that can be better understood by economic approaches, it's really, as Sumeet was just mentioning, the expansion of the human enterprise into previously unoccupied areas, and this can be well understood from a net economic benefit point of view. So land use change is a function of where we can get the greatest economic benefits at least costs, some function of that. But the same is true with natural resource exploitation, and so species that deliver the greatest economic benefits to people are going to be harvested until the costs of doing so exceed the expected returns. And then it's the same with human-wildlife conflicts. So species that entail high levels of costs will generally not be tolerated by people living near them unless the benefits that they perceive to come from those species are higher. So I think to echo what Andrew had said, it's actually very difficult to understand any of the threats to biodiversity without an understanding of economics, because all of the problems we're dealing with in conservation have this root in human behavior, and hopefully a solution rooted in human behavior as well.
Great, thank you, Dr. Naidoo. Professor Gulati, what net benefits would we see if we implemented economics-focused approaches in conservation?
Yeah, so this is my cue to go back to the idea of morality, right? I think partly this is sort of also just overlapping with what both Robin and Andrew have said before. Robin was talking about how it's sometimes harder to have the social scientists collaborate, but it's easier to have the natural and the natural scientists and the economists collaborate. And I think some of it comes from the fact that some people believe the market and the economic viewpoint may be a vice, and I think it is partly true. I think in the world of sort of glaring inequities, our economic system is responsible for many of those glaring inequities. But I've also sort of appreciated the simple philosophical underpinning that economics has given me. It's sort of helped me interpret morality, like I said, in a very general way. And this is exactly how I teach, and I think most environmental economists teach economics, is we're trying to maximize societies, not individuals, societies' benefits and costs. And these benefits and costs are not just those that are captured in the market. So it can sort of, it really should help, if taught right, for individuals to see how individual greed can make society worse off. It can help us see how ignoring distribution can make society worse off. It can help us see that how we can encourage the market to incorporate those amenities that are often ignored by it. So sort of so it's sort of true that narrow market-based approaches like those advanced by mining and natural resource development cause many of the problems in conservation today. But economics and markets are also a fundamental part of our world, and we can't wish them away. So the way to advance conservation, I think, is from the framework that I've gotten from economics, is to recognize the failures in our market systems, reform them so that conservation can do better. And I know there's a subset of economists who believe markets are the solution to everything, but I think that's a subset, and I think it's an increasingly small subset of economists who believe that that's the way it should be. And I think there is a small subset of conservationists who believe markets are the root cause of all evil. And I think both the economists need to accept the failures of the market, and the conservation should accept that market participation is inevitable. And it influences the behavior of the same people they wish to change. So I think if we get an acceptance like this, that's the major net benefit I see of implementing economics-focused approaches in conservation.
Thank you, Professor Gulati. My next question is to Dr. Naidoo. What are the different ways to utilize economics to investigate important ecological and economic issues in conservation?
Yeah, thanks for that question, Simran. You know, so there's many different tools, but I guess, you know, to me, maybe the most important point here is that, you know, I think it's more important to adopt or think about a mindset or a framework, you know, when thinking about how to use economics in conservation rather than particular tools. Again, this is reiterating a point that I think all of us have made now in this session, and it's that understanding that people and various institutions and governments and so on, you know, will tend to make decisions or choices on options that they perceive to have the highest net benefits to them. And you can measure those benefits in many different ways. It's not just monetary, but, you know, that's what we tend to do, you know, as people with certain exceptions. And so I think if you frame it in this way, I think it opens up, you know, many avenues for research where ecologists and economists can collaborate in order to quantify and communicate also the benefits of biodiversity and the natural world, you know, that might be hidden from view or unrecognized by people due to the, you know, the limitations of our understanding of how nature works, and also our, you know, the still limited understanding of how nature delivers benefits to us. And I think, you know, to me, this is where some of Andrew's work has really been, you know, extremely powerful. So it's, you know, uncovering and quantifying net benefits that wild nature delivers to us that we may not be aware of or perceiving, or you know, if we are aware, we kind of take it for granted because it's not highlighted in a way that we can, you know, understand very well in terms of its magnitude. And so I think, you know, in some ways, trying to understand the economic benefits of nature has to me has two purposes. So one is, you know, a bit narrow. So it's to quantify the specific benefits that a particular species or ecosystem may be delivering, you know, for the purposes of a specific policy decision or a government action. And that can be useful for, you know, for those contexts. But I think equally or maybe more important to me at least is simply being able to communicate to the general public and others that nature has an economic benefit, and that, you know, we're starting to increasingly understand what that looks like. And I think that can result in a deeper appreciation for how valuable the natural world actually is, and so how important, you know, conservation is. And Andrew alluded to this earlier, but it can really help us reach, I think, potential stakeholders or allies in conservation, you know, who may not be motivated, you know, by the type of intrinsic or moral, as Sumeet says, you know, values of nature, but rather by sort of more hard-nosed economic evidence that doing conservation is actually in our own best interests.
Absolutely. Thank you, Dr. Naidoo. Professor Balmford, do you think pitching conservation ideas and goals in an economic framework is enough for policymakers to prioritize environmental objectives?
No, I don't, but I think it's part of the answer, and it depends on who you're talking, you know, who you're trying to address. So, you know, at global level, we know there's a whole load of other things besides economic arguments or, you know, rational arguments at all that might determine decisions. But it's part of it. I think it's a key part of that. In as I was saying earlier, getting the attention of some people, you know, as Robin was just saying, who might not necessarily be genuinely interested in conservation for other reasons. I think that's important. I think there's some real caveats that come with that. So we know that some of the values that we might ascribe to nature are vulnerable to they're vulnerable to fickleness. We might go off something that we think was not important but becomes less important. They're vulnerable to things like the pandemic, so that, you know, insofar as a place might have been estimated as being of tremendous economic benefit to its community, or to the government that's responsible for it because of tourism, you know, that will have just taken a big hit, that argument. So we shouldn't have put all our eggs in that basket. It's vulnerable to innovation. You know, we will find other ways eventually that bring the price of I anticipate the price of carbon will go up in the next few decades, but I can imagine eventually it might come down. And then if we put everything is around an economic argument around the value of carbon again, we've got a problem. The values we come up with aren't immutable, and we need to be mindful of that. And we should never ever lose the arguments of you know, the moral arguments we've been talking about. Another problem is, of course, that decision making is not an economically rational activity at any level. You know, we make decisions for lots of reasons, of which, yeah, you know, we're not homo economicus, and bits of, you know, money or economic considerations, monetary considerations might come into them, but there'll be other things that we need to understand. Again, economics can help with that, but we need to recognize those things. But I think because it's Earth Day, I'm just going to be a bit optimistic. And I think some of the things that we've been thinking about around this piece, this community of people, you know, for 20 years, 30 years, as Robin said, some of those have, I think, been made more tangible by the past and still ongoing, you know, awful year. In that, and it's we all of us are seeing this from different perspectives, from our current, you know, from our countries, where the situation our countries are in at the moment. But certainly where I'm coming from, I think politicians have begun, some politicians who weren't persuaded have begun to realise that scientists, when they come up with some of these rather alarming forecasts of what we're doing to the planet, actually they're not lying, they're not making it up. We were at risk of a pandemic. Climate change is real. Destroying biodiversity will cost our economies. You know, so I think there's some important messages that might come through there. Some of these problems are very large scale. They need rapid action, and they need coordinated global action. We're not going to solve the climate any more than we are the COVID crisis if we act unilaterally or fail to take others with us. But also that actually, when we need to, countries can work together and solve and address problems at least quite swiftly. And on top of that, I think people care in ways that perhaps politicians sometimes don't necessarily take account of. They care about their communities. They care about things beyond the everyday, and they care about what's happening to the planet. So on an optimistic note, I think quite a lot of these issues as to how we really engage with are things potentially changing? I think I'd like to think that there might be some little bits of good that come out of this, current dreadful period we're in.
Thank you, Professor Balmford. I think we have time for one final question before I take questions from the audience. So I'd like to address this question to the whole panel. How do we evaluate the economic effectiveness of approaches such as community-based conservation? Professor Gulati, can you share your thoughts first?
Yeah, so just sort of going back to what my training was, I think my training has always been about evaluating effectiveness of all interventions, and in conservation or not, right? And I think, so I think we should always be continuously evaluating what we do and questioning what we do. This is especially true when it comes to economic instruments of policy. When it comes to community-based, so sort of, I think it's a little more complicated when it comes to a community, because there's a whole lot of benefits that come from there being community-based reforestation. But one could sort of think about what's the role of poverty in accentuating things like human-wildlife conflict in that community. What's the wait? I think I'm looking at my wrong notes here, but just I think when you think about communities, you also think about if you're looking just at indicators for biodiversity itself, or for reforestation, or for the community engagement there itself, that you have those, you need to evaluate that. But I think I've sort of learned to evaluate the role of community engagement in a more holistic way, in a way that that is not completely based on standard economic markers. And I think economics can do a good job at evaluating the causal impacts of any intervention, like we talked about before, but there's social impacts there that may not be measured purely by conservation outcomes or the economic outcomes for the community itself. So I think once we have what we want to measure well defined, we can use the tools of causal inference to answer the impact of any community setups.
Thank you, Professor Gulati. Dr. Naidoo, what are your views on this?
Yeah, thanks. So maybe just illustrate with an example from Southern Africa and the country of Namibia, where I've been working off and on for the last 15 years. So there, in terms of community-based conservation, it's known as CBNRM, or community-based natural resource management. And it really has as one of its fundamental tenets or premises that local communities will conserve species and nature, when they perceive that it's in their best interest to do so. And so I think it's very amenable to the type of economic analyses of its impact that Sumeet was just mentioning, because there's this kind of very economic principle at its heart. And so, we can conduct, and we have conducted, economic analyses of interventions in Namibia around community-based conservation, and we can demonstrate how various types of benefits flow in different ways to different people within local communities. And again, to reiterate a point we made earlier, that this is really important for communication, and that's whether it's to various levels of governments who are debating within different ministries their support for this type of conservation program, or whether it's people in wealthier Western countries whose governments and private citizens and others support conservation in Africa, but who sometimes have difficulty understanding why local communities might want to benefit from activities like hunting that they don't agree with, or why tolerance for these magnificent species that we all want to conserve, like elephants and lions, can be low on the part of communities. And when you explain these things through a cost-benefit lens, that people can relate to that maybe a bit in terms of their own costs and benefits that they sort of look at in their day-to-day lives. And so it puts it sort of on a footing where maybe some understanding can be gained. But I think it's also important to emphasize, and I think sometimes we who have worked on CBNRM make the mistake of overemphasizing economics to the detriment maybe of or ignoring other factors that are really important. And some of the work that we've done in Namibia suggests that 1 in 10 people in these communal areas are experiencing direct attacks on the form of wildlife, and yet they mostly state that their attitudes towards wildlife is nevertheless positive. And the economics benefits that they receive plays a part in that, but they also report that there are many other types of benefits that are less amenable to economic valuation. So intangible things like this is a part of our culture. This is something that I want to, wildlife is something that I want my kids to be able to experience when they grow up. I just enjoy watching wildlife. So, I think we need to find ways of engaging, other types of science that can really help us bring all of these things, to bear when we're thinking about why people make the decisions they do about conservation, whether that's community-based conservation or other factors. So I think, economics is clearly an important component of that, but there are also, other dimensions and other types of science that can really help us do better conservation in those contexts.
Thank you, Dr. Naidoo. How about you, Professor Balmford?
So I don't think there's much I can add in terms of this estimating effectiveness. Economics gives us, powerful tools like where potentially full experiments, but if we can't do experiments, other ways of constructing counterfactual estimates so that we can try to get at causality, which is incredibly important and something which I think the rest of conservation is fast learning from fields such as economics and medicine, as Sumeet was saying, and very importantly needs to. So economics can provide tools for looking at those. One thing we haven't, one other thing, a point on this, which I think we haven't raised very much, but which I think is a very important element of some of the issues we're talking about, are to do with the sort of distributional and equity issues. We've talked about conservation as being overall beneficial to society, we think, from our studies and lots of other people's. And that probably is true. But it's also the case, as Robin was saying, that there are real costs, and those costs are borne they're not borne evenly across different stakeholder groups. Neither are the benefits enjoyed evenly across different benefit groups. And very often, at least in my experience, it's the case that global stakeholders, people like myself and maybe other people on the call, relatively wealthy people living relatively comfortable lives, will get all sorts of benefits from people elsewhere and people in our own country benefiting, conserving nature, whether that's climate benefits or existence value, knowing there's still there's still rhinos wandering around in the conservancies that Robin's talking about. We'll feel good about all of that. We benefit hugely. We pay very little of the cost, even if we're paying something to to WWF or something. It's still trivial compared with the benefits. So we're net beneficiaries. No wonder we support it. And yet, on the other hand, communities at the at the front edge, but the front line of that, may well be paying net costs. And I think obviously economics is a powerful and very important instrument for identifying those inequities, realizing that they need to be addressed, and realizing they need to be addressed if we're serious about making conservation itself sustainable and equitable, and then devising interventions that try to redress those imbalances of costs and benefits. I think those are key, and nowhere more so than in thinking about local communities in wildlife-rich areas.
Thank you, Professor Balmford, and thank you all. It has been a really engaging discussion. We will now take questions from the audience, and the audience can send us questions either to Ishika or myself. I think we have one question that's just come up about what solutions or approaches can developing countries apply with their developing needs and constraints? And if there's any specific case studies that you could draw on when it comes to this. So Professor Gulati, would you like to?
Sure, yes. Just in terms of developing countries, I think one of the biggest issues in conservation, which I think hasn't gotten enough attention, and Andrew just pointed to that, is the inequities that are determining a lot of the benefits and costs that obtain from conservation or obtain from exploitation, right? So I think developing countries, I don't know if there's an intervention that they need to do. I mean, this is also Earth Day. We've heard from the US today about its big pledge to reduce carbon emissions. I think there's interventions in terms of carbon emissions, which are hopefully complementary to what's going to happen in conservation. But I think a focus on inequity, because I mean, when I came to Bangalore last, where this picture is from, and then Kriti helped me go to the field in Karnataka, looking at some of the places we were serving, it really struck me the inequities of human-wildlife conflict itself. And I think in developing countries, those are even more stark than they are in a country where I live in now, in Canada, where I think just seeing the fact that human fatalities and casualties, which is what I'm most interested in, are seriously disproportionately impacting those who are the poorest and the most marginalized in the society, and much less impactful to people even within the frontiers of the forests who are relatively well off. And so I have a feeling, I think, especially when it comes to developing countries, the focus on inequity maybe needs to be addressed right away.
Thanks, Professor Gulati. Dr. Naidoo, would you like to help us with this question as well?
Yeah, I don't want to speak for you know the many countries for which I know very little, but again, let me give an example from Namibia, where you know this is historically a country that has suffered from massive inequities, for it being a part of South Africa and under the apartheid regime that we're all, I think we all know about, and so when we talk about inequities within a country, Namibia has had one of the the highest ratios of inequality amongst its citizenry. But one way in which it's been trying to address that is really by the devolution of rights to natural resources, such as wildlife, back to local communities. And in doing this has really unlocked the potential for community-based conservation to benefit not only biodiversity conservation, but also the well-being and livelihoods of local people. And I think it's clearly it's a very difficult thing for national governments to do, to give up power and to devolve it down to to sort of more local levels of government. So it's not an easy thing to do, but at least in Namibia, that devolution of rights and responsibilities to natural resources has really led to some successes, both on the conservation front, but also on the human well-being front. And clearly there's Namibia has some advantages with that type of approach. Compared to a country like India, the population density is just incredibly lower. There's still a lot of wilderness and a lot of wildlife left. But I think that principle can really help developing countries, but really all of us understand that again, if we're to succeed with conservation, it's going to be based on the decisions made by local communities. And to the extent that developing countries, but other countries, not just developing countries like where we live, where we're trying to redress the sort of historic inequalities with our indigenous populations and so forth, restoring, devolving some of those rights back to local communities is really, I think, a promising way for conservation, but also just for inequities and sustainability more broadly.
Thank you, Dr. Naidoo. Professor Balmford, could you share your thoughts with us about this as well?
Well, obviously, I think we're not a very controversial panel. We agree with each other on things, but I agree with what Sumeet and Robin have been saying. But and particularly that last point about tenure, security of tenure is clearly key, and the other elements of good governance that go with it is key to so many of these issues, not just conservation ones, and enabling people to make long-term decisions and so forth. So that's obviously would seem to be general in many cases as a good thing to be pursuing. To say something slightly controversial, from my own work, this isn't economic work, this is our ecological work really, but we've come to the conclusion that in the main, most creatures, most wild species don't get on with people. They decline pretty dramatically once we start doing anything very much to a piece of habitat, whether that's bringing in cows or starting to fish it a little bit or starting to put some crops in it. And we get a distorted view of that because as people, we spend our times in places where we are. And so most of the things we think of actually are the things that don't do so badly. But most things, if you look at it objectively, don't seem to get on with human mainstream economic activity, whether that's farming or fishing or forestry. What that means is that the fate of most biodiversity is going to depend on how much stuff we can not necessarily lock away, but keep away from productive systems, how much land or sea we can do. And that's going to be extremely difficult on a crowded planet, of course. Just following that, following that through, we know that there's some countries, a lot of places, are making very bold and impressive contributions to declaring protected areas and trying to keep them protected. And that's, I think, essential from the biodiversity point of view. But from the human point of view, and indeed ultimately from the point of view of the planet, that's not going to work if we don't do that simultaneously with trying to meet the costs of that, the opportunity costs that we've been talking about, by enabling people to, and encouraging finding ways of making more productive use of the rest of the land. So I would say that conservation interventions are only going to be effective if they're coupled, for example, with agricultural interventions, whether that's to do with the market or to do with agronomy or whatever. And that as conservationists, we therefore need to face up to the fact that those producers, whether they're farmers or loggers or fishers, they're not the enemy in this, they're the answer. Helping them to find ways of doing what they do on a smaller footprint of land or sea is going to be key to being able to safeguard, to be able to afford those areas that nature's going to need if we're going to feed a planet with 11 billion people by the end of the century. That's a slightly off-piste answer to the question. I'm sorry.
Yeah. I just want to add a little bit to that, though. I think partly how you would find sustainability is not just having people be able to do what they do on a smaller piece of land, which is, I guess, a technological improvement, and I think that's what you pointed to, Andrew. But it's also sort of the rebound effect there, which is something we want to worry about, and in economics we point out that getting people to pay for the true costs of whatever they do when it comes to the real the modern activity that we're talking about. I mean, and I'm guessing when you say about the half-earth kind of idea, you're talking about modern activity, not traditional hunter-gatherer activity, which often lived in sort of in the same places as wild animals did. But I think this modern activity needs to be able to pay for the real increasing cost nowadays of everything that it utilizes, the clean air, the resources that it uses, which are often underpriced. And if you don't combine this ability to be able to live more productively on the land we already have, if you ignore the increasing sort of benefits from then exploiting more because of the increased productivity, you may not end up with the solution you want.
Yeah, I'd agree with everything that you just said. And on top of that, I should have said, obviously we also need to do something about spiraling unnecessary demand for products that take a great deal more of the land than is necessary.
Mm-hmm.
Great, thank you so much. We have another question. How can we use methods in conservation which establish causality in cases where experiments are not feasible or possible? Do you think these methods are used enough in conservation science? Dr. Naidoo, would you like to go first?
Yeah, I missed a bit of the first part, but I think it's where, what do we do in cases where we can't do randomized controlled trials? And this is, Sumeet can correct me after I give my answer, because he's really, an expert in this where I'm not. But I think, there is a lot of potential to try and make, try and harness data regarding our conservation interventions, that if we can't do an experiment with those interventions, that the data that exists that's out there, we try and make it look more like what it would have been if we'd been able to do an experiment. And so this is where some of the tools from economics, who have been doing this for quite a long time. And, as Andrew mentioned earlier, conservation science is starting to learn from these types of, econometric techniques or techniques that have been applied in medicine, for example, to really help us improve our understanding and demonstration of causality and causal impacts of these interventions. And so, on the plus side, or on the negative side, for many of our interventions, yes, it's difficult to do randomized controlled trials for many reasons. But on the positive side, the world is increasingly awash in data, and so we're becoming, in many places, less and less limited by the data, but it behooves us now to make the best use of that data. And so these techniques where, quasi-experimental techniques from the program evaluation literature, where you try and make the data, look like what it would what it would have looked like if you'd done an experiment, I think, hold great promise. And so just an example I was involved with a couple of years ago, where we realized there was all this data out there on household surveys, of people that were geolocated, so we knew where these people were. These surveys were publicly available, and they asked all sorts of questions about, the health and wealth of people living in these households. And so we realized that we had an opportunity to harness this data to see whether, all else equal, do people who live near the world's protected areas, are they doing better off than people who are further away from those protected areas? But we have this problem, of course, where protected areas aren't randomly allocated across the landscape, so we get this sort of biased data set and impact if we don't account for that. But using these types of techniques to select data in such a way that it looks more like if those protected areas had been randomly allocated around the landscape, we're actually able to show that all else equal, there is a positive impact, at least on some elements of well-being in terms of living near protected areas. So I think there is great potential to use these types of data and these types of approaches to help us understand whether what we're doing as conservationists is working or not.
Great, thank you, Dr. Naidoo. Professor Gulati, would you like to share your thoughts on this?
I'm just going to make a plug for, so the fact that I think these techniques aren't that complicated, actually. They're quasi-experimental, they sound very jargony, but actually they're much easier than most techniques that people in conservation and ecology are already using. They're fairly easy to implement. It's a little bit sort of just a way of thinking counterfactually that needs to be implemented. So I want to make a plug for certainly using these techniques more, as much as possible. Quasi-experimental techniques can help us sort of answer some questions which we may have struggled with before. And the other thing I want to sort of talk about, Simran and I have spent some time over the last semester, because Simran came to a class in which I was talking about quasi-experimental techniques. So if you have any questions on sort of examples of where quasi-experimental techniques have been used in conservation, you can bug me, or you can even bug Simran, who's somewhat closer to you, for a list of ideas of where these things have been used in the past and can continue to be used in the future. It may seem like you have these large questions where some of the outcomes may not be measurable, but then there may be intermediary outcomes. The most important thing to remember is sometimes you may say, okay, I want to look at the status of a species based on an intervention, and maybe you don't have good data on the status of the species, but there may be an intermediary outcome like the amount of hunting or the amount of human activity, which you could measure sort of as an intermediate, but in a causal way from that intervention. So I think it's just a way of sort of thinking and being able to explore that in a little bit. Maybe it's an idea of familiarization. So I'm just making a plug that I think we should all sort of think about this and try and change the way we analyze data, at least somewhat, to answer some questions that we may not have been able to answer before using some of these techniques.
Great, thank you, Professor Gulati. Professor Balmford, would you like to share your thoughts as well?
Well, yeah, yes, and just to totally endorse what Sumeet's saying, as an ecologist who's trying to learn quite quickly from these sorts of techniques, are incredibly useful, and they're not perfect like anything else, but they're incredibly useful. And I found them, since I've been thinking about the world in more and more in a counterfactual way, all sorts of other things, nothing to do with conservation, become a bit clearer. Oh, that's not compelling evidence at all, because you haven't established a counterfactual. Helps me understand the evening news a lot more than I used to. So very much so, absolutely. The only thing I would say is there are also other techniques, I think, which can be useful. So I'm involved at the moment in a analysis led by a Finnish colleague on there was an apparent upsurge in the start of the pandemic in burning in protected areas in Madagascar, and together with a group of Malagasy colleagues, this Finnish researcher is trying to investigate whether that apparent upsurge is real, and we could have analysed it through a counterfactual approach. In fact, it turns out that the biology of fire is, and the bioclimatic drivers of fire are quite well understood. And so in that case, what we've been able to do, again, because the world, as you say, Robin, is sort of awash with data, is go back 20 years and build quite a powerful statistical model. I would say we, it's not me, clever people than me, but build quite a powerful statistical model which predicts fire incidents in protected areas in relation to the climate each month, which works pretty well. And then you can see these outliers. There's outliers with the, sorry, this is not published, so it's sort of hot off the press and confidential, if you can be so. But the outliers appear to be related to big events in Madagascar, and then the greatest outliers of all and most consistent ones were at the start of the COVID pandemic. So it appears as though there's something in there. So there's other techniques that we can use as well, which are quite it can be quite compelling as well. The important thing, though, is to just not take things at simple face value and always try to, make sure that you're making a sensible comparison in this kind of more holistic sort of system-wide thinking of which counterfactual approaches is forcing you to do.
Definitely. Thank you so much, Professor Balmford. Thank you all. As we're running out of time, we will have to conclude our webinar today. I want to take the opportunity to thank all of our panelists for taking the time out and participating in an engaging discussion today. I hope you in the audience enjoyed our CWS Wildlife Chronicles webinar. For more information about us or to get involved in our organization, you can write to us at outreach@cwsindia.org. Thank you again, and we'll see you at our next CWS Wildlife Chronicles webinar.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
Thank you.